Welcome back, fellow thinkers, to the deep dive. Now, as someone deeply immersed in the world of philosophy, I'm sure you, like me, are constantly striving to understand the very nature of experience.
It's a fundamental drive, isn't it? That insatiable curiosity to grasp the essence of what it means to truly experience the world around us.
Absolutely. And it leads us to some really intriguing questions. For instance, have you ever considered just how deeply intertwined our everyday encounters are with what we call art?
That's a fascinating and complex relationship, isn't it?
Yeah.
One that's often overlooked or taken for granted. The ways in which art permeates our lives, even beyond the traditional confines of museums and galleries.
Precisely. And that's why today we're embarking on a deep dive into the ideas of John Dewey, a towering figure in American pragmatism, a philosophical tradition that, for you as a philosopher, I'm sure resonates deeply. It emphasizes the practical consequences of ideas and the crucial role of experience in shaping our understanding of the world.
Dewey's pragmatism is certainly influential. He really shifted the focus of philosophy towards lived experience and the practical implications of our beliefs.
Exactly. And his work in aesthetics, particularly his pivotal book, Art as Experienced, published in 1934, really challenges us to rethink our assumptions about what art is and where it fits into our lives.
Art as experience is a cornerstone of 20th century aesthetic thought. It still sparks so much debate and discussion today, which is a testament to its enduring relevance.
Now, to fully appreciate the depth of Dewey's aesthetic ideas, it's essential to understand his wider philosophical project. Along with Charles Sanders Peirce and William James, he championed this uniquely American form of pragmatism. But he went even further. His earlier work, especially Experience and Nature from 1925, lays the groundwork for his later aesthetics. In that book, he really tried to rethink the very concept of experience itself, but along naturalistic lines.
Right, moving away from more traditional dualistic views of mind and body, subject and object.
Exactly. He really stressed this dynamic and continuous interaction between an organism, what he often called the live creature, and its environment. He was pushing against the notion of experience as just these isolated internal sensations.
So more of an active, engaged process of interaction and exchange with the world.
Precisely. And he saw aesthetic experience as, in his own words, the highest form of this interaction, a point where the organism and its environment achieve a kind of complete and fulfilling harmony. For a philosophical mind seeking a comprehensive worldview, that connection between our very basic interactions with the world and our most profound aesthetic encounters is, I think, incredibly compelling.
It really elevates the aesthetic, doesn't it? Dewey doesn't relegate art to some secondary realm of experience. He places it at the very heart of what it means to live a rich and meaningful life.
Absolutely, and that's exactly what we're going to be unpacking today. Our mission, if you will, is to delve into Dewey's core arguments about aesthetics. We'll explore his concept of aesthetic experience, what characterizes it, what makes it so unique and valuable. We'll also critically examine his critique of more traditional ways of viewing art, what he famously called the museum conception of art, this tendency to isolate art, to separate it from the everyday flow of life.
The museum as a sort of sterile container for art, cut off from the vibrancy of lived experience.
Precisely. And finally, we'll consider the broader implications of his ideas for how we understand the role of art, not just for individuals, but for culture as a whole. I'm hoping that by the end of this deep dive, we'll have a much richer and more nuanced understanding of Dewey's lasting contribution to philosophical aesthetics.
Sounds like an ambitious plan, but a worthy one, no doubt. There's a lot to unpack in Dewey's work. It's incredibly rich and layered.
It is. But it's also surprisingly accessible and engaging. Now, it's important to note that Dewey's engagement with aesthetics didn't begin with art as experience. Even in his very first book, Psychology, published way back in 1887, he was already grappling with these themes, and it's fascinating to see how his thinking evolved over time. In psychology, for instance, he placed a huge emphasis on the role of rhythm in mental life. He really saw it as fundamental to how we perceive the world, how we organize experience, how we express ourselves.
Rhythm is a kind of structuring principle for experience.
Exactly, bringing unity to variety and breaking variety into unity. And not just in the arts, he saw it operating throughout our experience. Now, this was early Dewey. He was still very much working within an idealist framework, and this comes across clearly in his treatment of imagination. He saw creative imagination as this really powerful faculty, a way of grasping the deeper meanings of things and finding sensory forms that reveal and embody those meanings in a way that's both illuminating and pleasurable.
So imagination is a bridge between the realm of ideas and the concrete sensory world.
Exactly. He even echoed Kant in describing its aim as the free play of the self's faculties. So there's this emphasis on the active role of the subject, the individual, in shaping meaning through imagination. It's something that continues in his later work, but it takes a different form within his more naturalistic framework.
It's always fascinating to see how a philosopher's ideas develop and change over time, the continuities and the ruptures.
Absolutely. Now, later in psychology, Dewey turns his attention to feeling, and specifically aesthetic feeling. He defines it as this distinctive feeling that accompanies our perception of the ideal value of experience.
Interesting. So aesthetic feeling is tied to our recognition of something's ideal potential or its inherent purpose.
Exactly. He even uses this really striking example, a train engine, of all things. He argues that we perceive a train engine as beautiful to the extent that it successfully embodies its ideal function, overcoming distances, connecting people, fulfilling its purpose.
It's a very functionalist view of beauty.
It is, and even at this early stage, it hints at this connection between aesthetic appreciation and the successful realization of an object's inherent potential. Now, what's interesting is that in this early view, he actually excludes things like taste and smell from the realm of the beautiful.
The so-called lower senses.
Right, and also feelings tied to things like ownership or any purely external goals. He was really focused on this idea of harmony, the agreement of experience with what he saw as the self's ideal nature that constituted beauty for him at this point. And he saw art as this attempt to satisfy the aesthetic impulse in human nature, to express the ideal, which he linked to the completely developed self.
There's a real emphasis on self-cultivation and the idea of art as contributing to the development of a more harmonious and complete individual.
Absolutely. And it led him to this, I think, rather interesting hierarchical ranking of the fine arts.
Based on their perceived level of ideality.
Exactly. With poetry at the top as the most ideal and things like architecture at the bottom, it very much reflects the idealist underpinnings of his early philosophy.
A framework that, as we'll see, he significantly revises later on.
Precisely. Now let's fast forward a bit to 1916 and Democracy and Education. Now this book primarily focuses on, as the title suggests, educational theory. But Dewey doesn't abandon his interest in aesthetics. In fact, he continues to explore these themes, particularly the vital role of imagination in education. He sees it as crucial for breaking free from what he calls mechanical methods in teaching.
So imagination is a way of fostering genuine engagement and meaningful learning.
Exactly. And this is where we start to see his naturalism really emerging. He begins to argue against this fundamental separation between aesthetic and ordinary experience.
A key move in his philosophical development.
Absolutely. He suggests that fine art doesn't offer an escape from daily life, but rather it enhances the very qualities that make everyday experiences appealing.
So there's beauty to be found even in the mundane, the everyday, if we learn to perceive it.
Precisely. He was pushing against this traditional view of the fine arts as existing in this separate, rarefied realm, distinct from practical life.
A kind of art for art's sake perspective.
Exactly. He really criticizes this traditional division between useful labor and leisure, where leisure and the fine arts are often privileged. And he felt that this distinction was far too prevalent.
A very pragmatist critique of the traditional hierarchy of values.
It is. And this directly connects to his later work, where he argues for a new understanding of the relationship between means and ends. He says we shouldn't see means as just instrumental to ends, but rather as integral to them, enriching our daily experience, giving it direction and meaning.
So the process, the way we do things, becomes just as important as the final product or outcome.
Exactly. And this carries over into his aesthetics, where he emphasizes the importance of the aesthetic qualities inherent in the very process of artistic creation, not just the finished artwork itself. Then, just a few years later, in 1920, in an essay titled Reconstruction in Philosophy, Dewey paints this really compelling vision of an ideal future where ideas are deepened through imaginative vision and the fine arts, bridging the gap between what he saw as religious and scientific values.
A kind of synthesis of different domains of human experience.
Exactly. And art, he believed, would play this transformative role in how we perceive and experience the often harsh realities of modern life. He even envisions making a living becoming synonymous with making a life worth living.
A very Deweyan ideal, finding meaning and purpose in our everyday activities, and art is a key to achieving that.
Absolutely. And he returns to art's social role a few years later in his book, The Public and Its Problems, published in 1927. Here, he sees art as this vital means of communicating ideas essential for positive social change. He even goes so far as to say that artists are the true purveyors of news.
More effective than traditional journalists. That's a bold claim.
It is. But he argues that art is uniquely capable of sparking both emotion and perception, which he sees as essential for social transformation in ways that just reporting the facts cannot. He even uses Walt Whitman as an example, someone who embodies this ideal for him.
Interesting. Whitman as a model for the socially engaged artist.
Precisely. And he concludes that for a true community to flourish, we need this art of full and moving communication to permeate our increasingly mechanized world. Then, in 1931, in an essay called Qualitative Thought, he starts to anticipate some of the key arguments that will appear in art as experience, specifically about this logic of artistic construction. He senses this breakdown of traditional logic and argues that a successful artwork possesses this underlying pervasive quality that defines it, guides the artist's thinking, a logic of qualitative thinking, he calls it.
So a logic specific to the process of artistic creation.
Exactly. And it lays the groundwork for his more fully developed analysis of aesthetic form in art as experience. Which brings us finally to the main focus of our discussion today. Art as Experience, published when Dewey was in his 70s, it's a much more mature and sophisticated work than his earlier writings on aesthetics. His understanding of the arts here is just so much richer and more nuanced. And a big part of that, I think, was due to his close collaboration with the art collector Albert C. Barnes, to whom the book is dedicated.
Barnes had that incredible collection of early modernist painting.
He did. Think Van Gogh, Matisse, Renoir, Cezanne, all those big names. And Dewey actually served as the director of the Barnes Foundation for a time. He quotes from Barnes frequently in the book, and many of the examples he uses come directly from Barnes's collection.
So Dewey's direct engagement with actual works of art, particularly the radical innovations of modern art, really informed the development of his mature aesthetics.
Absolutely. It gave it a real concreteness and groundedness, and I think that's one of the things that makes art as experience so compelling. It's both theoretically rigorous and deeply rooted in actual artistic practices, and it stands as a systematic and comprehensive aesthetic theory, right alongside those other big names you mentioned earlier, Collingwood, Heidegger, Adorno, Beardsley. It's become one of the primary texts in philosophical aesthetics.
It's truly a landmark work. It sparked so much debate and discussion in the field, and it continues to be hugely influential.
It does. Now, Dewey's aesthetic theory in art as experience can be best described as moderately naturalist. What does that mean? Well, he sees the active seeds of art in natural processes, but he doesn't try to reduce artistic phenomena solely to the natural world or try to explain them purely through evolutionary biology, as some contemporary approaches do. Instead, his naturalism is emergent. He wants to show how aesthetic experience and culture, as we understand them, arise from those very basic natural foundations of life.
So a kind of continuity between the natural and the cultural.
Precisely. And at the core of this is that continuous interaction between a living organism, remember he often calls it the live creature, and its environment. And he argues that this ongoing interaction, it's characterized by these constantly shifting phases of disarray, instability, unsettlement, and the subsequent restoration of harmony. That's the basic fundamental pattern of all experience for him.
A dynamic interplay between balance and imbalance.
Exactly. It's this constant process of adjustment and readjustment. And he famously writes, life goes on in an environment, not merely in it, but because of it, through interaction with it. It's this emphasis on interconnectedness that's led some to call his whole conception of experience, and by extension, his aesthetics, fundamentally ecological.
Right, a real emphasis on the interdependence between the organism and its environment.
Exactly. Now, because of this naturalist viewpoint, Dewey is deeply critical of attempts to idealize art, to separate it from the objects of concrete experience. He really rejects this notion that art's primary value lies in revealing some higher, more profound reality that exists beyond the natural world.
So against any sort of transcendental or purely spiritual interpretations of art.
Precisely. For him, that kind of interpretation is just another example of this persistent human desire to create a sense of permanence and stability in a world that's constantly changing. He even traces the origins of many problematic dualisms, high versus low, material versus ideal, that historical contempt for the body, the fear of the senses, back to this, what he sees as an artificial split between spirit and nature. And for Dewey, either art is a natural continuation of our inherent tendencies as living beings, or it's some peculiar, isolated addition that just springs from within humanity.
And he's firmly in the former camp, right? Art is a natural outgrowth of human experience.
Exactly. He sees art as rooted in this constant movement between instability and stability, doing and undergoing, which he sees as inherent in all of our experience. And that becomes the bedrock of his aesthetic theory. He even says these biological commonplaces are something more than that. They reach to the roots of the aesthetic and experience.
It's a very bold move to try and ground aesthetics in basic biological processes.
It is. And while Dewey really embraces this naturalist starting point, he's also aware of some of the potential negative connotations that come with it. He knows that science, particularly in the modern era, has often been seen as this force that strips away the very qualities of experience. The color, the texture, the emotional resonance that make it so rich and meaningful.
Right, that reductionist view that science leaves us with this cold, sterile picture of the world.
Exactly. But Dewey argues that a properly understood naturalism doesn't have to do that. He says, the world in which we live is a world of colors and sounds, of pleasant and painful things, of the beautiful and ugly, of the noble and the base. It is the business of a naturalistic philosophy to interpret these things in terms of their origin and function.
So naturalism is a way of revealing the inherent richness and value of experience rather than diminishing it.
Precisely. And he even suggests that only a truly naturalistic approach can properly account for the emergence of something as complex and marvelous as art. Because for him, if art's not a natural continuation of our basic tendencies as living beings, then where does it come from? How do we explain its existence?
It's a challenging question, isn't it? Where does art fit within a naturalistic worldview?
It is. And Dewey offers us, I think, a really compelling answer. So for Dewey, the primary goal of aesthetic theory isn't to elevate artworks into some rarefied spiritual realm separate from everyday experience. It's to reveal, and I'm quoting him here, the way in which these works idealize qualities found in common experience.
So art as a kind of intensification or clarification of everyday experience.
Exactly. He sees it as a fundamental mistake to view the aesthetic as this kind of luxurious intruder in our ordinary lives. Instead, he argues that the aesthetic dimension should be understood as the clarified and intensified development of traits that belong to every normally complete experience.
It's a very democratic view of aesthetics, isn't it? Making it accessible to everyone, not just a select few.
It is. He really wants to break down those traditional barriers between art and life. And this leads him to critique what he calls the museum conception of art. This is a central target of his mature aesthetic theory, and it's particularly relevant for us as philosophers. Now, for Dewey, this museum conception epitomizes this tendency to compartmentalize art, to see it as separate and distinct from everyday experience.
Right, this idea that art belongs in museums, in galleries, in these designated spaces, and that to experience art, we have to go to those places and leave behind the concerns of ordinary life.
Exactly. And he traces this conception back to the 18th century and the rise of this idea of fine art as a unified category distinct from, say, the sciences, religion, and crucially, the practical arts.
So art becomes this autonomous domain with its own internal rules and standards.
Precisely. And unlike the practical arts, whose value was seen as tied to external goals, fine art is seen as having its own inherent intrinsic value, and that value is fully realized within these institutional spaces.
Right. Museums become the arbiters of taste, the guardians of artistic value.
Exactly. And Dewey sees this whole development as a kind of philosophical fallacy, which is an interesting move. He thinks there are these underlying preconceptions that shape our inquiry before we even begin to consciously investigate something. And in aesthetics, he thinks the fallacy is this deep-seated assumption that art and the aesthetic must be separate from everyday experience.
So it's like this starting point that we don't even question, but it colors everything we think about art.
Exactly. And for Dewey, the solution, as in other areas of philosophy, is a more careful, direct examination of experience itself, particularly how aesthetic experience naturally emerges from the common patterns and structures of all experience. That's what his naturalism is all about.
Getting back to the roots of experience.
Precisely. Now, Dewey offers a few historical reasons for why this idea of art as autonomous, separate, became so dominant. And interestingly, he connects it to the rise of both nationalism and capitalism.
That's an intriguing connection. How does he see those forces playing a role?
Well, he argues that both nationalism and capitalism reinforce this tendency to put art on a pedestal, to remove it from the more mundane aspects of life. He sees this happening on a national scale, where museums become these showcases for a nation's cultural achievements. He even calls them, rather sarcastically, the beauty parlors of civilization.
Right, so art becomes this symbol of national pride and prestige.
Exactly. And on a more individual level, he criticizes what he calls the nouveau riche, who he thinks often collect art just for status, not for any genuine aesthetic appreciation. And all of this leads to artworks becoming, in his words, stale art products rather than dynamic artworks that genuinely interact with and in experience.
So art becomes commodified, stripped of its vitality and connection to lived experience.
Exactly. And Dewey thinks this is ultimately detrimental to both art and life. It creates this esoteric idea of fine art and reinforces this perception of the everyday world as inherently lacking in aesthetic potential.
A kind of impoverishment of both art and experience.
Precisely. And to counter this, Dewey draws on these really interesting examples from non-Western art traditions. He points to cultures where art is deeply integrated into daily life and ritual.
Right, where there isn't this sharp division between art and everyday activities.
Exactly. He points to things like domestic utensils, furnishings, rugs, mats, even weapons, and how they were often central to community life, used in rituals, ceremonies, all sorts of things.
So art as serving a vital social function, not just as an object of contemplation.
Exactly. And he sees this as evidence that aesthetic objects don't require this special setting, this separation from the everyday. He thinks the modern concept of fine art is a relatively recent development, and that art, as a more fundamental phenomenon, originated in those shared rituals and ceremonies that were so central to early human societies.
It's a really interesting perspective. Art as something that's deeply rooted in communal life and practice.
Absolutely. Now, if art isn't fundamentally confined to museums and galleries, then what exactly is aesthetic experience for Dewey? Well, his account focuses primarily on the internal qualities of the experience, what it feels like to have an aesthetic encounter. Philosophers often call this kind of approach internalism.
So shifting the focus from the object itself to the subjective experience of the perceiver.
Precisely. And for Dewey, aesthetic experience is unique. It's a kind of culminating moment in experience where we achieve this sense of complete and fulfilling engagement with the world.
And he has that famous phrase for it, an experience, right?
Mhm.
He really emphasizes the unique and distinctive nature of aesthetic experience.
He does, and he often uses examples to illustrate what he means, like finishing a challenging game, having a really engaging conversation, or even savoring a delicious meal. These are all moments where we achieve this sense of completion, of wholeness, of fully realizing the potential inherent in the experience.
So it's not just about art in the traditional sense. It can be found in all sorts of activities and encounters.
Exactly. Now, Dewey never really provides a strict definition of aesthetic experience. He doesn't give us a list of necessary and sufficient conditions. But he does highlight certain key features. And one of the most important is its temporal structure. Aesthetics experience unfolds over time. It's dynamic, and it takes time to complete.
Right. It's not just a fleeting sensation. It's a process that develops and evolves.
Precisely. And there has to be this sense of accumulation. Later phases of the experience have to build on what came before. They can't just be randomly strung together. And aesthetic experiences are often very intensive. They condense complex elements, emotional, formal, into a single encounter.
A kind of heightened intensity of experience.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes this feeling of productive resistance. Now, this isn't just an obstacle that gets in the way. It actually fuels the development of the experience. It provides that necessary pushback that allows the experience to unfold in a meaningful way.
So resistance is a creative force.
Precisely. And then, of course, there's rhythm. Aesthetic experience has its own internal momentum, its own direction, and its own sense of fulfillment or resolution. In a truly aesthetic experience, he writes, every successive part flows freely, without seam and without unfilled blanks, into what ensues.
There's a real sense of organic unity and coherence.
Exactly. And importantly, it doesn't end abruptly. There's this natural summation and fulfillment of the earlier phases. So to sum it up, a truly aesthetic experience involves inception, development, and fulfillment.
A very nice way of capturing the essential features.
I think so. Now, Dewey contrasts these kinds of rich, fulfilling experiences with what he calls inchoate and anesthetic experiences.
What sets those apart?
While they unfold over time, but they lack that unified, coherent development. They're full of holes, jarring transitions, dead ends. There's no real sense of development or accumulation. He describes them as slack, discursive experiences that are not an experience, and they lack that sense of closure, that feeling of fulfillment.
So they're kind of fragmented, incomplete experiences.
Exactly. They're either too loose and disconnected or too mechanically structured. And because of this, they just don't have that same aesthetic quality.
It's interesting how He defines aesthetic experience by contrasting it with what it's not.
It is. It helps to clarify what he's after. Now, Dewey's naturalism really comes through in his emphasis on aesthetic experience. He sees it as this powerful demonstration of how complex and meaningful experiences can emerge from the most basic elements of interaction: direction, resistance, rhythm, accumulation. And for him, even something as seemingly elevated as aesthetic experience is continuous with those fundamental interactions we see even in the simplest organisms.
Right, so there's this through line from the most basic forms of life to the most sophisticated human experiences.
Exactly. And it's also important to note that for Dewey, traditional art is just one source of aesthetic experience. A really engaging conversation, for example, can have that same continuous interchange and blending that he sees as so essential.
So the potential for aesthetic experience is much broader than we might typically think.
Absolutely. And this leads him to criticize this traditional philosophical distinction between categories like the practical, the intellectual, and the aesthetic. He thinks these categories are often set up in opposition to each other, but he argues that genuine aesthetic experiences can occur within activities we might typically think of as practical or intellectual.
So a mechanic working on a car, a surgeon performing an operation, they can have aesthetic experiences.
They can, according to Dewey. He says the aesthetic quality of an experience depends on its inherent qualities, not on the category we put it in. So for him, the real enemies of the aesthetic aren't the practical or the intellectual, but things like the humdrum, slackness, submission to convention.
It's a very interesting way of reframing the issue.
It is, and one of the most insightful aspects of his view of aesthetic experience is his description of it as this interplay between doing and undergoing. He thinks this really captures the essence of aesthetic engagement. Now, doing, for Dewey, represents that active dimension. It's the effort, the conscious shaping of the experience. But undergoing is equally important. It's that receptive side, the letting go, the allowing oneself to be moved or affected by the object or the environment.
So a kind of balance between active engagement and a receptive openness.
Exactly. And he sees this as a kind of ideal for all experience, with aesthetic experience being a particularly vivid expression of it. He even writes that art, in its form, unites the very same relation of doing and undergoing, outgoing and incoming energy that makes an experience to be an experience.
It's a very dynamic and reciprocal view of experience.
It is, and this leads him to draw these really interesting parallels between what the artist does in creating a work of art and what the audience does in experiencing it. He says that the final artwork isn't just a passively received object, but the result of this complex process of planning, choosing materials, highlighting certain aspects, simplifying others, and organizing them into a coherent whole. And he thinks the audience shouldn't just passively receive this finished product.
Right. We have to actively engage with the work, try to understand the artist's choices, the challenges they faced, the process they went through.
Precisely. And in this sense, experiencing art is, for Dewey, a kind of recreation of the object in the mind of the perceiver.
So both the creation and the experience of art involve this active shaping of material and experience.
Exactly. Now, while Dewey really emphasizes the subjective nature of aesthetic experience, he also pays attention to the objective conditions that make it possible. And this is where his concept of aesthetic form comes in.
Right. Not just any object or experience can evoke an aesthetic response. There are certain qualities that make something aesthetically compelling.
Exactly. And Dewey's analysis of form is an attempt to identify those qualities. Now, just as he sees aesthetic experience as dynamic and evolving, he sees form as something active and alive. It's not just a static structure, it's something that actively enhances, prolongs, and purifies perceptual experience.
So form is a kind of guiding force that shapes our experience of the artwork.
Precisely, and he defines it pretty simply. Form is that which organizes material into the matter of art.
So it's the way the various parts of a work are arranged and interrelated.
Exactly. And for Dewey, those parts aren't just independent units, they're dynamically related. He talks about the way things bear upon one another, their clashes and unitings, the way they fulfill and frustrate, promote and retard, excite and inhibit one another.
It's a very dynamic and relational view of form.
It is, and this leads him to emphasize the way we perceive form. He says it's not just about isolated sensory perceptions, but a serial process where each perception builds on the one before it. He thinks aesthetic form has this qualitative unity that we can sense immediately, but to fully experience it, we have to engage with it over time.
So a kind of cumulative process of perception.
Exactly. And this leads him to challenge that traditional distinction between spatial and temporal arts.
Right, the idea that some arts unfold over time, like music, while others exist in space, like painting or sculpture.
Exactly. And Dewey argues that even those arts that we traditionally think of as spatial actually have this significant temporal dimension. He uses the example of architecture, which is often seen as this paradigmatically spatial art. But he points out that even experiencing a simple hut requires time, and a grand cathedral, you have to move through it, experience it over time for its complexity to reveal itself.
So time becomes a factor in how we experience all art forms.
Exactly. And if aesthetic experience has these objective conditions that make it possible, then aesthetic form, in turn, has its own set of formal conditions. And Dewey identifies those as continuity, cumulation, conservation, tension, and anticipation.
And he highlights the role of resistance, right, as that essential element that drives the development of the experience.
He does. He says, without internal tension, the experience of form would just be this fluid rush to a straightaway mark. It would lack that complexity, that development, that sense of fulfillment. And he's very clear that aesthetic form is objective. It's grounded in the material world. He writes, there can be no aesthetic experience apart from an object. For an object to be the content of aesthetic appreciation, it must satisfy those objective conditions without which accumulation, conservation, reinforcement, transition into something more complete are impossible.
So there has to be something there in the world that can support and structure that aesthetic experience.
Exactly. And one of the most fundamental of those objective conditions is rhythm. Dewey sees rhythm as the first characteristic of the environing world that makes possible the existence of artistic form.
Rhythm is a kind of fundamental principle of both nature and art.
Precisely. And he's very specific about what he means by rhythm. He rejects this simplistic notion of rhythm as just the steady, predictable recurrence of identical elements, what he calls the tick-tock theory.
So more than just a simple repetition of the same.
Exactly. He thinks each beat or pulse in a rhythm doesn't just repeat the past, it actively propels the whole process forward. He uses these vivid natural examples. A pond moving in ripples, forked lightning, the waving of branches in the wind. He contrasts those with what he calls a monotonous roar, which lacks that dynamic quality.
Right, so rhythm has to have this sense of energy, of movement, of development.
Exactly. And it has to have that element of accumulation that he sees as so essential. So for Dewey, recurrence in aesthetic form isn't just about repeating the same thing over and over. It's about how those repetitions function within the larger experience. He uses the example of a bird's wing beating. Each beat is both a release of energy and the start of a new accumulation of energy, which creates this sense of anticipation for the next beat.
A very nice way of capturing that dynamic quality.
I think so too. And while we often associate rhythm most strongly with music, Dewey thinks it permeates all art forms, even those we typically consider spatial, like painting and architecture. He thinks denying the presence of rhythm in these arts stems from a misunderstanding of perception.
So rhythm as this underlying principle that unifies seemingly diverse art forms.
Exactly. Now, another central question in aesthetics that Dewey tackles in art as experience is that of artistic expression. How can an artwork be both expressive and communicative?
A question that's plagued philosophers for centuries.
It has. And for Dewey, these two aspects aren't separate, they're intertwined. He says that objects of art communicate precisely because they are expressive.
So expression is the very basis of arts.